Hello, my name is Patrick Noble, and this is my presentation on the topic of open source. Open source products have grown tremendously in the last decade. However, in the consumer market, open source software remains a minority. According to the research company Gartner, more corporations turn to open source to run their software more than any other operating system. In 1998, only 10% of firms used open source software, but in 2011, the total number of firms was over 50%. Additionally, there are a number of leading technological and service companies who partner with and support open source. These companies include AT&T, HP, IBM, Intel, Google, Nokia, Ubuntu, and many more. Today we will discuss what it means for something to be called open source, a brief history of open source technology, the availability of open source technology in different fields, and lastly, we will discuss Linux and its founder, Linus Torvalds. Here's an image of many open source companies, but what does it mean to be called open source? Simply put, open source received its name from the actual openness and availability of its source code. Something is open source when it can be modified and shared without a license being required for its use. So how is open source different than the competition? Contrary to proprietary software, which has a closed source and requires operators to own a license to use the product, open source is free to its users and encourages the creation and modification of code for each product. Most computer users will not interact with a computer's source code, but for programmers and creators, this is incredibly useful. The source code is used to control how a piece of software works, so individuals can create a highly customizable product. The open source way is the movement of applying the principles of open source to fields other than software and technology. These principles include open exchange, participation, rapid prototyping, which leads to faster solutions, merit, which says the best idea is used because everyone has access to the same data, and lastly, communication. Because of the many possibilities of implementing open source software, this is taking income away from many proprietary sources, which cannot meet the demands of consumers as well as open source. Although it may not be a proprietary product, the developing companies can still be for-profit organizations. Rather than charging operation fees through licenses, open source companies may still charge for services and additional products that work in tandem with the open source product or software. So how was open source developed? The idea of knowledge sharing existed before the modern version of open source. In the automobile industry, for instance, a patent on two-cycle gas engines was owned by a group of capitalists. With this patent, they could force manufacturers to follow their guidelines and face fees or lawsuits. This lasted until 1911 when Henry Ford won a lawsuit against them, which led to the creation of the Motor Vehicle Manufacturers Association, where members would create their own technology and patents, but they were to be shared openly and freely among other members. Immediately prior to the internet, ARPANET was run by the Department of Defense and was an early telecommunication network. In the program, engineers would routinely work together and were encouraged to use a request for comments, which means many individuals could share their expertise and develop the best possible software. Today, open source today has ideas and products everywhere. Some of the fields involved in open source technology include electronics, beverage products, medicine, robotics, engineering, and computer software. Open source electronics abide by the same standards for all open source items, no licensing fees, and an open code. Some examples of the products are LaserSor, which is an open source laser cutter, Leon processors, and OpenMoko cell phones. OpenMoko began as a project in 2007 and concluded around 2011. The phones were built on a free software system using Linux. A very new and not highly publicized field of open source is that of beverages. Open colas, as the name may suggest, are open source sodas. The recipes are posted for the public to see, and allegedly taste very similar to their proprietary counterparts. Most of the companies involved in open colas profit off the sale of necessary ingredients. To use a very specific example, Brewtopia is a brewery located in Australia, and their claim to fame is the openness with which they brew. They allow the general public to design their own beer online, and then they will brew it according to the customer's liking and ingredients. The inclusion of open source ideals in the field of pharmaceuticals is a radical change from the normal, highly profitable, and not so humanitarian field. The Tropical Disease Initiative and the Open Source Drug Discovery for Malaria Consortium are supreme examples of the open source way. They focus on a community involved in developing something truly remarkable and possibly life-saving. The field of robotics is often more involved in open source than one might believe. Hobbyists from all over the world collaborate to develop the most useful computing agent. For robots to be considered open source, their blueprint or software code must be public knowledge. The Science Commons was created as an open source alternative to expensive postings in science journals. The idea of Hyperloop was proposed by Elon Musk, the creator of Tesla Motors as well as SpaceX. In 2013, Musk stated that he believed Hyperloop to be a futuristic form of public transit. Hyperloop would take individuals on a journey through a large tube with passengers being delivered in pressurized capsules. Lastly, the field of computer software is what most people associate open source technology with. Open source computer software is directly related to most forms of technology that adhere to the open source way. The software is a result of a community collaboration and has a public code. Linux is the largest version of this software. Linux began in 1991 as the product of Linus Torvalds. With the creation of Linux, Linus had 4 goals in mind. He dreamed that anyone could use the software for any reason. Anyone could change the software as they needed. They could have the freedom to share the software, as well as the freedom to share their changes. Today, Linus acts as the coordinator for Linux and is one of over 5,000 developers for the software. Many companies turn to Linux for their computing needs because it is so highly customizable and always up to date. On average, a new version of the software is released every 3 months. Major companies, stock exchanges, and the servers of online giants are all run on Linux. Linux is found everywhere, even if you don't realize it. In conclusion, we've discussed what it means for something to be open source and how the concept was developed. The open source way is found in many different fields and has countless applications in the modern world. Lastly, we discussed the beginnings of open source software with Linux and its founder, Linus Torvalds. As I mentioned before, open source ideas are making their way into an increasing number of fields. One must wonder, what does the future hold for proprietary and open source products? Thank you.